Have you ever been caught in a moment where everything seemed to turn against you? Where the cold seeped into your skin, and the silence around you felt heavier than the darkness itself? James Carter never thought his night would end like this. Stranded on a desolate, snow-covered road with a broken-down car and no sign of help. The winter air bit into his skin as he stepped out, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing night, and the eerie stillness made the road feel like a forgotten place. He tried restarting the engine, but it only gave a weak sputter before dying again. Frustrated, he popped the hood, though he wasn't exactly a mechanic. His fingers, already numb from the cold, fumbled uselessly as he stared at the engine, hoping for some miracle. Then, in the distance, headlights appeared. Relief washed over him. Help was coming, but as the vehicle drew closer, his relief was replaced with something else, something colder than the winter air. It was a police patrol car. James stood still as the car rolled to a stop beside him. Two officers stepped out, their figures illuminated by the red and blue flashing lights. The older officer, Sergeant William Grant, had a broad build, a thick mustache, and a hard, unreadable expression. His partner, Officer Ryan Blake, was younger, his posture dripping with arrogance. The smirk he wore sent an unsettling message before he even spoke. William raised his flashlight, shining it directly into James' face, forcing him to squint. Having car trouble? William's tone was flat, almost uninterested. Yes, James replied evenly, keeping his voice calm. The engine just died on me. Ryan crossed his arms, glancing around. Not the best place to break down. His voice carried a mocking edge. James exhaled slowly. He had learned long ago that situations like these could escalate in an instant. William took a step closer, shining his flashlight into James' car without asking. "You got anything in there we should know about?" he asked casually. But there was nothing casual about the way his eyes narrowed. Before James could respond, William opened the car door and started rummaging through his belongings. "Hey," James started, but stopped himself. There was no point in arguing. He knew how this went. Ryan smirked. "You don't mind, do you? Just making sure everything's safe." James clenched his jaw, keeping his hands visible. The cold wind howled around them, but the chill running down his spine had nothing to do with the weather. William straightened, closing the door. "Where do you live?" "In the suburbs a few miles from here," James answered, forcing himself to stay calm. Ryan let out a low chuckle. "A guy like you? Living in the suburbs?" He exchanged a glance with William. "Must be nice." James ignored the jab. He had faced this kind of subtle hostility before. William stepped even closer, his voice dropping slightly. "It's a cold night. Maybe you need to warm up." Ryan's smirk widened. "Yeah, some exercise might help. How about some push-ups?" James felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't some naive kid. They weren't joking. This was a power game, and they expected him to play along. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. William tapped his flashlight against his palm. "Something wrong." James exhaled, then slowly lowered himself onto the frozen ground. The icy surface bit into his palms as he braced himself. "One," he counted, forcing his muscles to move despite the cold. Ryan laughed. "Look at that. He follows orders." James kept going, each push-up chipping away at his pride. He wanted to stand, to call them out for the abuse, but he knew better. William leaned down slightly. "Hope you're learning something tonight, Carter." James kept his gaze on the ground, swallowing the fury that burned inside him. They had no idea who he really was. Not yet. And then everything would change. Because in just a few weeks, he would be their new chief of police. Could power truly shield someone from justice forever? Or was it only a matter of time before the past caught up? As James Carter stepped into the precinct for the first time as chief, the room buzzed with whispers. Some officers stole curious glances at the new leader, while others exchanged uneasy looks. Among them, standing stiffly near the back, were William Grant and Ryan Blake, the same two officers who had humiliated him on that frozen road just hours ago. Neither of them knew yet. James carried himself with a quiet authority, his steps firm but unhurried. The crispness of his uniform, the steadiness in his gaze. Everything about him commanded respect. He scanned the room, his eyes briefly locking onto William and Ryan. A flicker of recognition passed over their faces, but they quickly dismissed it. They still thought he was just another name on the roster. Just another officer stepping into a role where power was often abused, not wielded for change. But they were wrong. At his side stood Thomas, a seasoned officer who had spent years watching corruption go unchecked. He had seen good men pushed out and bad men rise to the top. But today, standing next to James, he felt something different. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. James stopped at the front of the room and let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "That I know what some of you are thinking," he began, his voice steady. "Another chief, another set of promises. But I didn't come here to make speeches. I came to set things right." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others remained still, watching. This station will no longer tolerate abuse of power. No more intimidation. No more looking the other way when our own cross the line. His voice sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. "If you wear this badge, you wear it to protect, not to prey." William and Ryan remained frozen in place. The words hit harder than they should have, but still, they didn't understand. "Not yet," James continued. "Some of you have seen things and kept quiet. I understand why. But silence is over. If anyone believes they are above the law, I promise you, they will face consequences." The weight of his words settled over the room like a brewing storm. Some officers nodded in approval. Others cast wary glances. Ryan leaned toward William, muttering under his breath, "He talks tough. Let's see how long that lasts." William smirked, but said nothing. James knew their type well. Men who thrived on fear, who believed authority gave them immunity. But their time was running out. Over the next few weeks, subtle shifts began to ripple through the department. Officers who had once been silent started speaking up. Small complaints turned into formal reports. Cases that had been buried found their way back to light. The walls around William and Ryan began to crack. They brushed it off at first, confident that no real threat existed. After all, no one had ever had the guts to challenge them before. But then, the unthinkable happened. An officer, one of their own, came forward. The testimony was damning. Falsified reports, coercion, abuse of authority. And the evidence? Solid. James sat at his desk, reviewing the compiled reports. He knew he had enough to move forward. The question now was not if they would face justice, but how they would react when the truth caught up to them. Thomas entered the office, placing another file on James' desk. "It's time," he said. James nodded. When William and Ryan were called into the meeting room, they entered with the same arrogant confidence as always. But the moment they saw the file on the table, the thick stack of evidence, something shifted. James didn't waste time. "I won't ask if you have anything to say for yourselves," he said coldly. "The evidence speaks loud enough." Ryan scoffed. "This is ridiculous." William smirked, but it faltered at the edges. "We've been here a long time, Chief. You really think one report is enough to take us down?" James held his gaze. "It's not one report. It's many. Witnesses. Documents. Patterns of misconduct stretching back years. You didn't just cross a line. You burned it to the ground." For the first time, William said nothing. "You have two choices," James continued. "Cooperate and walk out of here with some dignity, or fight this and lose everything." Ryan's fingers curled into fists. "You set us up." "No," James said, leaning forward. "You set yourselves up the moment you thought your badge gave you the right to abuse people." William's jaw tightened, but there was no denying the truth in James' words. "You'll regret this," he muttered. James tilted his head slightly. "Maybe. But the real question is, will you?" As security escorted them out, whispers spread through the station. Some officers were stunned. Others looked relieved. A few even looked hopeful. That night, as James drove home, he knew this was only the beginning. Removing William and Ryan was one step. There were others like them. The system had cracks that ran deep, and he had just started chipping away at the surface. When he pulled into his driveway, something caught his eye. A small, folded piece of paper stuck under his door. His stomach twisted as he unfolded it. "Back off, or your family will pay the price." Attached was a photo. His wife. his children, that a quiet rage burned inside him. They thought they could intimidate him, that they could make him back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Thomas, we have a problem." As James Carter stood outside the station, reading the anonymous threat, he felt no fear, only a deepened resolve. William Grant and Ryan Blake wouldn't surrender easily. They had built their careers on intimidation, and now that their power was slipping, they would do anything to get it back. The next morning, James gathered Thomas and Robert, his most trusted allies. He placed the letter on the desk. "They're not done," he said. "They think they can scare us into backing down." Thomas exhaled sharply. "They don't know you very well, do they?" Robert nodded. "We expected retaliation, but they're underestimating us." James met their gazes, unwavering. "We've come too far to stop now. We do what's right, no matter what." The team agreed, but they knew they had to be cautious. William and Ryan still had connections, and James wasn't naive. This battle was far from over. A week later, a disturbing report came in that a patrol officer had been found unconscious in his vehicle, his radio disabled. The evidence pointed to an orchestrated attack. Someone was sending a message. James and Thomas visited the officer in the hospital. When he woke up, his voice was weak but clear. "They told me this is just the beginning," he whispered. James clenched his jaw. William and Ryan were making their move. That night, as James drove home, he noticed a black car tailing him. He switched lanes, the car followed. He turned down a side street. It stayed right behind him. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He wasn't going to play their game. He pulled into a well-lit parking lot, stepped out, and faced the car head-on. The vehicle hesitated, then sped away. He exhaled, his determination hardening. If William and Ryan thought fear would stop him, they had chosen the wrong man. 2 days later, James received a confidential report, one that changed everything. William Grant and Ryan Blake had been caught trying to bribe an officer into planting false evidence against James. But the officer, loyal to the new leadership, had recorded everything. James wasted no time. He called for an emergency board meeting. When William and Ryan were summoned, they walked in with forced confidence until they saw the evidence spread out before them. "Your game is over," James said calmly. "You tried to manipulate and intimidate your way back into power, but you failed." Ryan scoffed. "You think you've won, Carter?" James leaned forward, his voice steady. "Winning isn't the point. Justice is." The board, which had once turned a blind eye to William and Ryan's corruption, had no choice but to act. Within hours, official charges were filed. Their fate was sealed. As James walked out of the meeting, he saw Thomas and Robert waiting for him. "It's over," James said, exhaling. Thomas nodded. "Because of you." Robert smiled. "No, because of all of us." The station had transformed. Officers, who had once been afraid to speak up, now stood tall. The community, once distrustful, had regained faith in their protectors. That night, as James looked over the city, he knew the fight for justice never truly ended. But with people like Thomas, Robert, and the community by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Because real power didn't come from fear. It came from integrity, and James Carter had plenty of that.